Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you're watching or listening to this instructional video or audio package on interpersonal neurosynchrony, INS. We'll explain what that is all about in a few moments, but I'd like to welcome my partner in crime, so to speak, a master of interpersonal neurosynchrony and all the associated offshoots of that, and you'll find out why he's laughing in a minute. So please welcome the man himself, Mr. Paul Gutteridge. How are you doing,
Thanks,
Paul?
Alex. Yeah, great. Thanks, Alex. Cheers.
As you are laughing, I suppose it's wisest that before we start to sort of brainstorm where we're going to go with this in terms of different sessions and different topics, is why were you laughing at interpersonal neurosynchrony?
Well, two reasons. Number one, it's difficult to say. And number two, whenever it comes to anything neuroscientific, gosh, they make it so complicated, such long words and explanations for things that actually, well, ultimately in the real world can be boiled down to some fairly straightforward things, which I'm sure we're going to get into on the podcast.
I'm sure we will over the various sessions. Now, with that in mind, because this might end up being, we don't even know what this particular session is today, which for the historical record, we're recording on the 10th of August, 2023. This may be that we put this out as a podcast to give people a bit of an insight into what the interpersonal neurosynchrony training, video and audio, and possibly some notes with it as well, package will contain, to get them to register their interest to be alerted of the special launch discount price. That may be a route that this goes. So we will see. But going off interpersonal neurosynchrony, you said to use fancy terms. People who know me, if they don't know me, they'll soon come to terms with the fact that I like to cut out the bullshit. So what interpersonal neurosynchrony sounds nice, but it sounds to me like one of those things, and I do know what it is, but I mean devil's advocate for viewers and listeners, that is being given a fancy title, like you said, just to make people who study it or use it feel like they belong to some special secret group that know these things that other people don't, and that therefore gives them some kind of position of elevation or power above other people. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I'm sure that kind of stuff does take place. It's like the black magic in at the secret source. You have to know this code to get through and to be accepted. The more generous side of me would say that actually these are really important things. How do humans interact? How do they communicate? What's the evidence? And actually, there's some really clever people who are doing some fantastic research using fMRI scanners, how language works, etc., and how our bodies respond at a deeply conscious and a subconscious level to what we in the business would probably call the mechanics of rapport. And I think it's really useful that the scientific community actually provide. Well, I think it gives us confidence to know actually the stuff that we're doing, whatever the stuff that you're doing is, actually now has a basis in science. And maybe it's telling us what we already instinctively know, but actually to have some good old rigor behind it is super useful. So yeah, it could be taken two ways. It could be fancy schmancy stuff over here, but actually more generous side says there's some great people doing some excellent work that gives us confidence in actually what you're doing works. And then you can codify it and you can replicate it. That's always useful.
Because I always play devil's advocate. I have a podcast called Hypnosis Week. This may become an episode to let people know about the forthcoming release of the Interpersonal Neurosynchrony course. With that in mind, I am going to play devil's advocate, and I have a few points. I'm logging them here so that I don't forget them. Number one, I'm going to go back to that idea that why the fuck call it interpersonal neurosynchrony when effectively you've just said, in our terms, in most people's normal terms, just saying that it's the effective use of rapport would mean pretty much the same thing. Why? Why?
Yeah, I think. So in part of my other world, I mean, you know this, Alex, in part of my other world,
which we're going to come to shortly, because I want people to learn about that. But yeah, Sorry, continue.
So in my other world, in areas of what they call track two diplomacy, etc., actually defining terms is really, really important. Language is super powerful. Language and influence. Well, we all know propaganda, all that kind of jazz. Language super important. So defining terms and having specificity around our definitions is helpful. And I think when it comes to, when we talk about rapport, my goodness, we may have loads of different definitions unspoken about what rapport is. So I think when scientists look at stuff and they say, look, these are a specific set of words that mean X, Y, and Z, it helps cut through, oh gosh, there could be loads of different ways of understanding this. And the more specific and technical the language and defined actually then drives out, this is specifically what we're talking about. Even if you might say, oh no, that sounds like a lot like rapport, it's a specific way of approaching that subject and then saying, this is the breakdown biochemically and all the feedback and the neurophysiology that takes place, which means rapport. But that's my fancy answer.
Okay. Again, none of this is meant to be offensive either to you or to viewers or listeners who might have their preconceived ideas. It's just I like to push the envelope and go, that's all well and good, but does it really fucking matter if we know what's going on chemically? Or rather, let's rephrase that to where, because I know we spoke before and there are examples where it does matter and help, where would it be beneficial to actually know that these things are going on?
I suppose there's a few answers to that. So my first answer, say from a therapeutic point of view, I think if one can establish that something chemical is taking place, then we can therefore understand, okay, so is this a pathological issue? So therefore it needs medicating. And I know you have opinions on medication in mental health health and treatment. Or actually, it's not a pathogenic problem, it's a salutogenic, in other words, solution-based understanding. So if we can say, actually, these bunch of chemicals are taking place, and that's normal, and within that range, you can have certain treatments. Actually, we're seeing certain chemical changes happen, which are pathogenic, which means that we may need to treat with medication. Now, all that said, what's the point in knowing the science around, oh, these chemicals are doing this in the brain, etc.? Well, when it comes to some of the other stuff, which I'm sure we're going to get onto, if you understand some of the process and can actually observe through body language, tonality of voice, breathing, color, tone changes in skin in different parts of the face and the neck, pupil dilation, fine digit movement, whatever we've been trained in fancy schmancy world, actually being able to observe those, they are happening faster than our prefrontal cortex, our higher critical reasoning faculty, the fancy bit of our brain, which makes us such amazing human beings, and sometimes very wicked human beings. But once we can spot those things taking place, because they're happening faster than our cognition, but they're firing nevertheless, we can therefore make more effective interventions, whether that is from a therapeutic point of view, whether your business is coaching, or whether you're doing more covert or overt stuff around influence, persuasion, and whatever else is in that world, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Oh, we will, because we're going to dig into your background shortly. But I just want to kind of tie up the loose ends on this because, again, playing devil's advocate. But although I'm playing devil's advocate, the truth of the matter is with most of these things, it is what I genuinely, sincerely believe and is my experience. So interpersonal neurosynchrony sounds nice, but there again, it's just a term that effectively means getting rapport. I mentioned before this idea that, well, I things give them fancy titles just so that people feel that they belong to some special group and they feel better and all powerful because they know something, they're elevated. So therefore, arguably, it gives them a sense of confidence and in some level a boost to their self-image and self-esteem and self-identity. Now, when they get that boost and they've got that inner I know a secret you don't type thing. Now, some people take that too far and become Mr. or Mrs. Smug, like people who go on these NLP courses, walk out and become the most annoying twat in the room. because they're taking things way too literally. But the people that don't go way over the top and use the things correctly, as we'll cover in future sessions of the actual course, end up with a kind of certainty or a knowing or a confidence within that knowing these things will help them achieve X, Y, or Z, or identify X, Y, or Z. And because of that, I believe that that gives them a certainty, a confidence, a calmness that automatically is going to alter that individual's body language, non-verbal cues, the way that they are acting around other people, just because of this inner knowing and certainty and confidence in what they've learned, that by virtue means they're going to, I would argue, just be a more relaxed, calm, in the moment, aware with all senses human being, so naturally are going to become more aware of things and act better and be more likely to develop rapport, even if suddenly they didn't use any of the techniques they'd learned that gave them that confidence. What's your sort of thoughts on that?
Oh, there's loads in there. There's loads in there. So yeah, I would agree that having clarity gives you confidence, and confidence means that you're physiologically, mentally, then physiologically, that mind-body connection, you behave possibly in a more relaxed way, which then, and a confident way, which then has a feedback loop that the other person senses that, whether it's conscious or unconscious, which then plays in the placebo effect, it plays into the Pygmalion, and you know the stuff. I think the other thing as well is that there
the
are
viewers and listeners probably don't know, so these are things we'll cover in future sessions.
Okay, we're going to get fancy, aren't we? See, we're using terms now. But one of the things that's really helped me actually with this is that broadly speaking, I need boxes to help my head navigate, like heuristics, shortcuts, models that help me navigate the world. So when it comes to scientific research and people are using fancy words that I sometimes don't understand, it takes me a while to understand it, think, oh yeah, I've got it now. I think there's three broad classes of people. You've got the inventors, the academics, the thinkers that are inventing and researching and coming up with all sorts of useful models and testing the scientific hypotheses, etc. So you've got the inventors, then you've got the interpreters, and then you've got the applicators. And most people, in my experience, want application. Actually, how can we do stuff? But the distance that we need to travel between the academic and the inventors to application is quite a long way, because there's a lot of words that need to be used. There's a lot of definitions. And then, so in the middle, you get the interpreters. And the interpreters are people who I understand enough about the inventors and their language and their theories and all the science, but I also have a felt and experiential understanding of what it means to, gosh, I just want to do something good. I want to help somebody move from A to B. I want to influence, persuade, read, assess, influence, whatever, in any contacts with human beings, mainly human beings, unless we're going for UFOs. But we want to do that stuff, but we need that clump of people in the middle who can straddle both worlds. And I wouldn't say I am the best at it, but certainly I have this interesting relationship between, I kind of begin to understand the interpreter, the inventors, the scientific language, because I know it's going to give me confidence, and I can use some fancy words in context to amplify authority in Robert Cialdini's influence and persuasion stuff there. But actually, being an interpreter is a very powerful place to be, because we can bridge a divide, which then we can boil down that fancy language into terminology that people like me understand, and maybe lots of other people would understand, who are actually really interested in doing application. But they also want to know that, is the application, has it got a basis that works? Well, people, I would suggest you're like this as well, Alex, that you're able to interpret the language of the fancy ones into everyday spiel that works. And you probably do it a bit more cheekily than I do, for sure.
Probably more swear words, but hey.
I think so.
And if we draw back slightly, you just said to him, you don't think you're necessarily the best at doing the interpretation. Well, I'd probably disagree, because before we even got to the point of starting this journey on putting this interpersonal neurosynchrony package together, we'd already talked a fair bit on many things, and very much so calling a spade, and the way that I believe that viewers and listeners will really get what could seem overly complicated from an outsider's point of view. Subjects like non-verbal communication, micro expressions, non-verbal signals, all the different offshoots of rapport. Now, the important thing is, as I always say, there's, from a hypnosis perspective, I always say there's shed loads, tens of thousands of trainers out there, but I blatantly go out and say nobody teaches the way I do, and I give this money back guarantee that others don't have the balls to, because I cut the shit out. Now, we're going to do that, you in particular, with interpersonal neurosynchrony, because you have been worn the t-shirt and worn it out in numerous different environments, which is the most important thing, because your inventors might come up with great ideas, but they rarely, if ever, test them out in the real world.
Yeah.
You have tested what we're going to share with people within the course in numerous different environments. So let's dig a little bit into the world of Paul Gutteridge, how he got to where he is now, and thankfully is where he is now, alive and well, which will become clear to the viewers and listeners in a moment, no doubt, why that is something that's significant. What was your journey to where we are now, Paul?
Oh, wow. So the end result was that I ended up doing what they call track 2 diplomacy, which is talking to people of interest to the state, whatever state that was, bringing people together for conversations who may or may not be able to get to people. So what led me up to a world where I was partly operating in business and then operating a lot in some people would think it's a secret world, and don't think I'm 007 or anything like that. But what led me there was interesting, actually. So my journey, I was born and brought up in a fairly roughish environment. Dad, former special forces, mercenary, all that jazz. I was a little guy. I'm short, 5'6", or meter 60 something for those of more of a European persuasion. But I was always a little guy on the estate who was all the big boys and girls, and I quickly had to learn how to talk and navigate my way through situations, saw a fair amount of trauma. And the reason why that's important is because people who begin to get good at body language, non-verbal influence, persuasion, rapport, neurosynchronicity, synchrony, all that kind of jazz, they will either have had trauma that they've overcome, they will either have worked out how to be quite deviant in order to navigate situations, or just had an interest that got trained. But I was the trauma one.
And I just literally jump in. Do you mean people who naturally become good at it? Because it's my understanding from our conversations that if people take the no bullshit route to learning these techniques that we're ultimately going to share with them in future sessions, that anyone to a certain degree can learn to use these things well. I think to clarify, you mean you were naturally finding you could do these things?
Yeah, naturally. And then you get the training, you can codify it. And the truth is, I mean, we're going to get onto this. As you say, there is so much to learn and has been backed up by all the fancy, the inventors with the science. There's loads of stuff there. There's a load of stuff that's out there that's not, by the way. I wouldn't trust it. But some of the stuff that's really backed up in the science, the truth is, under high stakes, high stress situations, we forget most of it. And that's where the science comes in. That's where our amygdala hijacks our prefrontal cortex and does all sorts of things with sympathetic and parasympathetic systems and what that means. So we need to be finding what's the fastest, quickest, easiest things to do, which have the highest rate of return. I have a phrase, big doors swing on small hinges. So if you've only can hold 5 bits of information in working memory, give or take 2, you're using most of your working memory to think, what am I going to do? I've got this really difficult client, or I'm talking to this person I'm in a basement and somebody's got a ski mask on and there's a gun and a knife. You know, that's the other extreme. Or I'm with somebody who's a whistleblower from a state actor and I'm being followed, and I've got to try and build rapport and navigate. I tell you what, as good as I think I am, I'm forgetting most of my skills. So I need to know only one or two that have the highest hit rate that are going to get me returns. And that's the cut through the crap stuff that I enjoy and you're a master at. But so my journey, I was born and brought up in that environment, and one thing led to another, and I had an experience of faith, you know, and I became a Christian. And I suppose some people be like, oh my God, what are you talking about now?
Don't panic, viewers or listeners. If you know my background, you know I have a thing out called the Bible, God and Hypnotism, and I point out that Jesus, if he ever did exist, or the multiple versions of him, were excellent hypnotists and street magicians, as I explained in that. And we have talked about these things. Believe what you want, just don't go hurting anyone. That's my view on it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, so let's cut all the dogma and all that kind of jazz out. It's just part of my story. And but what was interesting in part of that story is that I used to be accused by some, confused by others. They say, oh, you're a hypnotist. I've never even heard of hypnotism. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I thought, well, I don't think hypnotism actually exists. I think that maybe, I don't know. I was thinking, well, hypnotism, the word hypnotism hypnotist is a label. So it's been observed in people who can communicate effectively to get people to focus so much on one thing at the expense of others that they take on new beliefs and practices. That was kind of my understanding at that stage, because that was effective communication, whether you were in a church or motivational speaking or a CEO of a company or a politician or a media personality, it was the same. And then in my journey, 7/7 happened. And leading up to that, I'd worked all over the world with working into some of the toughest parts of different continents, setting up projects and talking my way in and out of gang situations. And I just have this knack from my history of being able to read and assess and influence behavior for positive, not nefarious purposes. Although you can do it for that, by the way, and we all know it. And woe betide anybody who says, oh no, you've got to have somebody's consent for them to actually bend to your techniques. No, no, I've seen enough of the world, whether in high stakes or low stakes situations, for people, myself included, to do things they didn't think they were ever going to do. And why did I do that? Well, there's a whole load of reasons why I did, and probably a whole load of reasons why those people do that. I kind of know the levers, and it's like electricity. You can either turn the lights on and bring light to the world, or you can electrocute people. It just depends how you use the tools. So anyway, I went through this journey. 7/7 happened, and I was asked to write in the media about terrorism. And I thought, actually, I don't really know enough about the ideological positions of those people. So I just started to reach out to different leaders, community activists, etc., who hold various views and opinions. And it seemed very short, very fast route to me ending up on this path of being this interlocutor, of being able to stand in the gap between people who hold various and varying opinions and actually bringing them together for conversations. And then one thing leads to another. I go for some training. It's like the movies. I get tapped on the shoulder, go to the US, I meet some people there. I'm trained for some folk in the Middle East. And I end up in this whole world, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in a bit, on actually earthing the training into real world situations where you're trying to help people ethically move from A to B. And of course, the implications and the applications into business, into therapy, coaching, they're all the same. It's human interactions, it's communication. So my light bulb moment, if you like, came in. There were people who were amazing at training, and some people were good at doing. And I realized that the people that were good at doing were not using most of the training, or they were using parts of the training. So some people would take different bits of the training. So maybe that's the reason why you need to train everybody and everything, because we were going to take different parts of it. depending on our proclivities. But I realized that there were 3 ways of doing things. There was the right way, the wrong way, and the long way. And I thought, my God, there is a lot of long way approach to this, let alone the wrong way, but a lot of long way. And the long way was overly padded trainings, which maybe were important because it appealed to different people who are going to take different elements. So I've tried to be generous. But I thought there was a quicker way to do it. So I started to codify what I was doing, even during the time I was doing it, into bite-sized chunks. And I knew there was going to come a point where I could apply that into business and therapeutic settings. And that was a transition point for me. Long answer, gosh.
It wasn't actually as long as, because I know I already have the foresight from our previous conversation. I think you've managed to put that together well. One thing I want to emphasize again is that your real world experience in business, yeah, if something goes wrong, it might be the difference between making this much profit or this much profit, or it might be in an interview situation, the difference between not getting the job or getting the job.
Yeah.
In the relationships dating arena, it can be the difference between having to go on a second date or getting blown away, or getting to final base and getting laid. It applies to all areas, but most of these aren't going to potentially get you killed. You've actually been in environments where, the grace of God, excuse the phrase, there have been nasty people around, or not necessarily. They wouldn't perhaps perceive themselves as nasty because they have their own agenda and aims and motivations. But if they took umbrage at anything you were saying or realised what you were trying to do, influence and persuasion could quite easily have turned into, physical violence, perhaps death.
Yeah, being at the bottom of somewhere with concrete around me. Yeah, and I think, as I say, there are loads of techniques. Loads of techniques. How do you read micro expressions? How do you see blood pressure changes? How do you use linguistic patter in order to bypass critical faculty, align around values, using body language techniques, all that jazz. One of the things I think that has been one of the most powerful is ego suspension. And that ego suspension combined with appealing to somebody's values, and there are ways to do it, actually has been a lifesaver for me. And it's that sense of, can I suspend my judgment enough to genuinely, whether I'm pretending to do it or not, I don't know, in the height of the situation, or maybe there is a bit of acting in there, of course there is. Can I suspend my judgment and ego enough to connect with that other person in a non-judgmental way? Synchrony, for argument's sake. And what is taking place? What little signals am I sending out? What tonality? What intention for those people who are more into thinking about quantum entanglement, etc.? And does that explain these things? And there's some research on that, and the work of people like the Heart Math Institute and etc. looking at all these areas. Actually, does my intention actually get in an unconscious way felt by the person sitting in the back of a van in the an Eastern European country when they are an enforcer for a people trafficker? I mean, that was quite scary, and that was quite scary. And I thought, I'm not getting out of this one if he decides he doesn't like me. But actually, that sense of ego suspension and genuine intention to really listen to somebody, actually, 2 ears and 1 mouth. I'm not doing it, I'm on broadcast now, but 2 ears and 1 mouth, you listen twice as hard as you talk, and twice as long. And those little things have a disproportionate impact. And even in coaching and therapy, that ego suspension and allowing the silence to do the heavy lifting and the intention to be felt has I believe anyway, a disproportionately positive impact. And then appealing to values as well. If you're bringing 2 people together who are clashing, and that people like Robert Dilts have did this years ago, researching, hierarchy, and it's Maslow on speed, isn't it? This values, this identity, this purpose
Well,
thing, right
it's
right at
Maslow's
the top.
hierarchy of needs repackaged so you can sell another cause.
I'll check you out. I can see out of this conversation, I'm going to be there. Oh no, Paul's always generous, thinking the best of people, and I'm sure they didn't do it for those reasons.
Bad cop, good cop, whichever side he appears on the video. Yeah,
that's right. But I think it's good to have the poking and the provoking, though, actually, that you bring, because it forces people like me, it forces all sorts of people to actually think about what they think about, question what they, ask a better question. What is the purpose? What, and you can cut through. But I think that the hierarchy around sort of beliefs and values and identity, to if one can get if you're in a tense situation, if one can help somebody see or come to an agreement on not the environmental friction between I want this, you want that, but actually say what values do we hold as individuals in this situation, and try to find some sort of alignment. Now, my limited understanding of therapy would suggest that's a bit like parts therapy. When I've listened to people talk about parts therapy, it's actually, what does that give you? What does that give you? And you go up through the hierarchy and you find the common place, and one collapses the other, and you come into a place of agreement. I suppose it's the diplomatic version of that.
A couple of observations and a question. So the observations, by the way, viewers, if you see my hand moving, it's because I've got a pen and I just make little notes so I don't forget. My observations on what you just said. There's the old saying that people like people who are like them.
Yeah.
Common interest. Now, in reality, I found that whilst there is an element of truth to that, a more truer and useful phrase to remember is that people tend to like people who like them, who are giving, whether it's non-verbally or verbally, expressing the fact that they find the person in front of them interesting, and that whether they've got common ground or not doesn't matter as much as the person you're trying to influence or persuade feeling wanted, liked, appreciated, cared for, valued, what depending on the context. That's one observation. The other is, you mentioned energy and quantum stuff. Well, I always just think of the times everyone must have experienced it, walking into a bar or a nightclub or a restaurant or some other environment, and just walking in and suddenly knowing you could cut the atmosphere with a knife. That's a phrase. Cut the atmosphere with a knife, and you just know, got to get out of here or a fight's going to kick off, and invariably it does. How did you know? You hadn't been in there. You felt it. You felt the energy. So without being winky wanky arty farty new age, we will talk in a non-tree hugging manner about the real world observations and uses of energy in these sessions. You mentioned 2 ears, 1 mouth. Listen twice as much as you talk, which reminds me of the founder of the Samaritans, Chad Vera, whose famous phrase was, in terms of therapy and counseling, was, don't just do something, sit and listen. In other words, the listening part, the making the person feel special, valued, appreciated, worthwhile, is arguably as, although Chad would say, and I would argue, more important than actually doing some wonderful therapeutic technique, or in a negotiation doing some wonderful persuasion technique, because that process of listening in itself makes the individual in front of you feel better, but also makes them, in a Cialdini's Persuasion and Influence book manner, probably at an unconscious level, but makes them feel that they owe you something.
Yeah, it's reciprocity. And there's another saying, and I use it quite a lot. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I thought it's so true. in my experience, it's been true. If there's that genuine care, then people can sense it and feel it. And oh gosh, that sounds abstract. How do you do that? You know, for people who are into modeling, NLP, general semantics, whatever the flavor is. Well, what's the structure of that? Well, that's kind of what I've done in terms of, well, what's the structure of caring in therapy, coaching, high stakes negotiations, sitting in the back of a van with somebody? What are the things that we actually do, think, say, observe in somebody else? What's the structure of it? And that's basically what I've broken down. Maybe what we're going to explore further as well is, well, what do you actually do then? Can we model this if you're an NLP? Can we develop a system if you're organizational dynamics and systems or whatever? Or actually, is there something that can help us in our therapy so that we can, at the end of the day, get to the heart of the matter quickly with speed and specificity? Those are the two things I'm really interested in. Business happens at the speed of trust. It's about liking, and the reason why that works is because, oh, here's the science bit. It's the mirror neurons. We like people who are like us and who like us. So there's the element of actually mirroring the liking, the reciprocity, and the liking, or that likability factor, that trust factor. Well, how do you amplify trust, and what shrinks trust down, what breaks trust? Well, actually, loads of research by anthropologists, people like Gerd Hofstede, the Lewis model. There's all these models out there by these clever inventor people that actually say, this is why that is happening. So then you can have confidence that when you go and do this, it's going to more likely happen than not happen. And I'm interested in the stuff that gives you the highest return for your investment in the shortest period of time, because I know, and I was quite good at it, I can codify lots of information quickly across multiple channels, whether it's face, voice, tone, linguistic, use of pronouns, Dr. James Pennebaker's work, etc. I could do it quickly. But even if I could do it quickly, the higher the stakes, or if I was nervous, a new client, if I was in a new situation, I'd forget so much of it. And so what was going to be memorable that I could practice, that was going to work? And I suppose that's been my overriding motivation with this stuff, is how do you break it down to the components that can be used day in, day out, week in, week out with people? And because we've got all sorts of things going on in our brains, we've got both implicit memory and explicit memory, and how the amygdala, how the thalamus takes in the information and then talks to the amygdala and triggers things at 0.25 milliseconds as opposed to the prefrontal cortex in 0.50 seconds. So it's going to the hijack center of our body quicker than it is going to the higher reasoning center of our body. And how do we slow things down? And the key phrase is, if you want to get good at this stuff, it's slowing your internal mechanisms down and actually thinking ahead of time, what's the outcome I'm after here? How do I slow myself down so that I'm in tune, not just with myself, but I'm in tune with the other person, and trusting that all the stuff you've learned and all the experience you've had will actually serve you at the right time, because the brain is extraordinary if we can regulate. And if you're in a therapeutic situation, we're teaching people to co-regulate. If we can regulate our internal stress levels, then we can bring out all this good stuff. So we can get into all that. It's fascinating.
Which we will in the actual training. We should just give people a flavour of the kind of areas that will be covered and learned. And it's pretty much adaptable to any area of life. The one thing that I noted, I put a note about what you said before and forgot to mention, was the actual question. I mentioned my observations, but my question was, you talked about people's values and how understanding them, finding them out, and I'm going to use the term using them, that information is a key to persuasion and influence. But in my experience, not everybody, there's always exceptions to every rule, always. However, in my experience, the majority of people think they know what their core values are. if you ask them and they consciously they think about it, and they'll say, oh, these are my core values. But in actual fact, in my experience, those are not actually their true core values. They have to dig deeper and deeper. The true core values tend to be stored, I'm saying metaphorically, in the unconscious, subconscious mind, the personal laptop computer. And you do have to, I've found, get critical faculty, analytical area, or some call it the executive function, bypass for the real values to come out, which can often be very surprising to the individual, that is their real core values, because often some of them can seem at first sight or realization so far removed from what they thought their real values were. Can you put that across in your terms, what you make of?
Yeah, no, that's very powerful, because in the cut and thrust of life, so I mean, we can apply it into a number of different areas. So say for example, you're doing high performance coaching. So I get asked to do quite a lot of that. And these are people who are super successful. If you measure success by, I earn this amount of dollars or pounds, I've got these houses and all that kind of stuff, it still doesn't mean that people are going to hit some sort of existential crisis of what's the point? What's the use? Or they are seeking to navigate a particular decision, whoever that they are, whether it's therapeutically or in a coaching situation. The values are interesting because we can start off by saying, so what's important to you about X, Y, and Z? And of course, people will answer in a certain order, as mainly from the top of their heads, blah, blah, blah. Oh, this is important, that's important, that's important. Now, for those people that have studied stuff like forensic statement analysis, the Undeutsch hypothesis is my fancy stuff over here, which is basically what is used by security services when they're interrogating text to see where areas of sensitivity are, deception detection, credibility analysis, and I did all the training in that world. You're taught to look for the order and see where the keywords, phrases, and values are. But in my experience, and I think you're alluding to this, is that, well, being overt about this, is that what comes out first isn't really the real stuff. There's something much deeper. And there's a way to elicit that, if we want to use a fancy word. There's a way to draw that out of people in a way that is non-threatening. And in my experience, say, for example, not just in a coaching setting, but
Can I just say, not just non-threatening. I know from our previous talks and from experience that there's ways of doing that without the person even being consciously aware that you've drawn it out of them.
Yeah, very much. And oh gosh, Alex, there's so much stuff here around how you stop amygdala spikes taking place in people using your language.
You can mention things briefly by all means, but in this episode, I think it's just an overview of what that could be an entire lesson in itself down the line. Who knows?
Oh, it's so powerful, so powerful. There's a book written by a guy called John Nolan. It's out of print now, called Confidential, and he's a former American spook, and it's about corporate espionage and all the techniques. And I remember I was working for an organization and eliciting, getting information out of people in bars in airports before they got on the plane, to see if they were taking contraband from one country to another. It was great fun using all these techniques of primacy and recency and how not to spike people on the way through. But it's supremely useful, and all we're doing is we're suspending our ego, and we are, let's be blunt about the raw recipe of these things. Is we're basically asking somebody, hey, so what's so important to you about X, Y, and Z? General chit chat, and they'll say it's this, it's this, it's this. And basically we're asking, I suppose from a therapeutic point of view, we're looking to get people to drop down. Okay, the next level. So what does that give to you? That would be a classic phrase that people would use in the coaching or NLP or therapeutic world. So, you say that family's important. What does that do for you? That's basically the raw ingredient, and we can ask it in different ways. Oh, that's really interesting. So tell me a bit more. Or we wait for that. They just told us a value that's really important, and it's often loaded with emotion. And we wait for a little bit of time, and it's called the affect curve, waiting for that to go down. And then we say, Alex, it's really interesting. We were chatting earlier on about X, Y, and Z. I just wonder, because circle back, you could tell me a little bit more about X, whatever X is, that value, love. And of course, the affect has gone down. They don't feel I'm interrogating them. I'm circling back. I can use some patter for argument's sake. Is, yeah, I wonder if you'd be so kind as to tell me a bit more about X, Y, and Z. And that whole phrase, I wonder if you to be so kind, is very simple but very clever bit of patter, which is, I wonder if you could be so kind. So we're using the rule of reciprocity and the social norms of kindness and graciousness, etc. But what I'm doing is I'm keeping the power with you. I'm not saying, look, I want you to tell me a load more because I want to probe into your life. You're saying, I wonder if you can help me. And people like helping other people in when they're in a conversation, and then you get more information.
I'm just going to do that, check whether it's my earphones or microphone your end, but slight tiny bit of distortion then.
So you might not. I didn't say.
No, I'm still getting a bit of distortion.
Oh, I don't know what that would be.
Oh, it isn't now.
Oh, there you go. I've switched to the right.
Oh, it's crystal clear again.
I've put a different headset. So yeah, we're asking those drop down questions, and actually, things slow down in people when they go inside and start to pull up deeper values, and they are the things that truly motivate. And of course, we're on dodgy territory potentially if it's high stakes situation. I remember I was in I was a long way away in another country in a bar. A lot of stuff happens in bars. And I was talking to a particular guy, and he was sharing stuff, and he was a person of interest, and we were just sort of chatting away, and he was sharing stuff. And when we use elicitation strategies, and elicitation isn't just about asking somebody an open question, it's also elicitation works when we make statements. I see the weather's nice today, leave a gap. We're not actually asking a question, we're making a statement. I see the weather's nice today. And we leave a gap, and people want to fill the space, so they start to share information. Or we can use what people like Jack Schaefer, who used to run the behavioral analysis unit at Quantico for the FBI. He's written some great books. He would talk about last three words. So basically, you're taking the last three words or a theme of the end of a paragraph or a sentence that somebody shared, and you're just repeating it back really quickly and leaving a gap, and people will start to give you more information. Once people start giving us more information and they start to drop down, of course, the deeper the value, there's a greater emotional or somatic response to that. It's visceral. We feel it within ourselves. And that's why we're so suggestible. And that's why we've got to be really careful, because somebody's beginning to peak, because that value can bring up all sorts of implicit and explicit memories. And I suppose from a therapeutic point of view, it could create an abreaction if it's attached to something else, because that value is being cut across because they've been abused or whatever. So we've got to navigate quite carefully when people are sharing more and more information. And in that particular situation I was in, a guy was sharing loads with me and suddenly realized that he'd shared too much. And he threatened to kill me. And we went outside. There was a couple of the other people with him, and I had to talk my way out of the situation. And I thought, Paul, be really, really careful, because to your point, Alex, people don't always know what their deepest values are, and they may be connected to both positive and negative experiences. And unfortunately for me, his deeper value around X was connected to a situation where he'd been abused. So that core value being cut across so violently that it created a violent reaction in him, which I was the object of his attention because I was the one drawing it out of him. So once your amygdala is hijacked, all the chemicals dump into the body. You go freeze, fight, flight, or fawn. He went fight. And I was a person in front. So I learned a valuable lesson about how much you draw out of somebody in a situation, but it's almost irresistible when somebody knows how to do it and they do it well.
Excellent. So I have a few more questions before we bring our first recorded meeting to a close, which I do feel now for the record. And none of this will be edited out. Things are never edited out of these things. And I do that on purpose because often in the moments of brain fart or unmeant pauses, gold can occur that wasn't pre-planned. So, you know, I say that to viewers and listeners genuinely over the episodes that will be put together as a step-by-step training course in interpersonal neurosynchrony, or if you prefer, high-level rapport, or if you want to just think of it as the total cutting edge of non-verbal and verbal, both non-verbal and verbal communication, persuasion, and influence. Call it what you will. Ultimately, we are going to discuss, demonstrate, give examples of things that genuinely work in the real world, things that I found work in therapy, things that Paul, depending on which side the video chooses to put him, has found work in the most extreme of situations, which I'm sure most of you will never be encountering. But hey, some of you may well work in those sorts of arenas or may do in the future. The point being, if these techniques used correctly can stop you from getting killed, then imagine how easily they can be used to help somebody overcome a habit, addiction, fear, or phobia, or higher end issues like post-traumatic stress disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is where my next question is, because I know that you've kind of withdrawn now from the non-state diplomat, track 2 diplomacy world, with all its dangers, and are moving more, although you're already involved in it, but more into what some would call the therapy world, some would call the coaching world, some would call mentoring, consulting. They're all just bloody titles and ways of marketing yourself, really. To help somebody get from one position to another, whether that's overcoming a habit, addiction, fear, phobia, saying goodbye to a stress, a tension, a worry, a fear, an anxiety, a trauma that's locking them in position, or a business block where they need to look at things differently.
100%.
The underlying principles and tools are arguably the same, aren't they, Paul?
Yeah, they are. And I think when it comes to the reason why I'm more formally operating in the sort of the therapeutic end of things is simple. Actually, I've been exposed to a lot of things that created intrusive thoughts, disturbed sleep, all that kind of stuff. And that's trauma, PTSD stuff, hypervigilance, hypersensitivity, all the stuff that I've used as a USP to be able to read, assess, and influence behavior quickly, but it burns through cortisol like nobody's business and fried my pituitary gland probably. But in all seriousness, I've, in that world, come across and continue to come up so many people who have been traumatized, you know, former soldiers, special forces, people involved with covert operations, law enforcement. But you know what? That is the same in business as well, and the same in life in general. And there's all sorts of things around that. But I come to realize that there are two elements. So a lot of the stuff in the body language, linguistic rapport, elicitation is using words and body language. Bang, bang, bang. You're doing different things, and we'll cover those. And incredibly powerful things to affect positive change or move through situations, take people from A to B. But when it comes to the trauma side of things, it goes beyond the what we would call top-down approach of a cognitive approach. It's bottom-up, it's somatic, it's felt, it's held in the body, it's held as images and representations in the mind, which trigger all sorts of chemical reactions. And I think that actually bringing those two together of saying, actually dealing with the somatic, felt, subconscious stuff that drives those horrible thoughts and feelings and painful things, actually that's step one. Actually, the next step is then how do we then live? How do we grow? How do we go from there with a sense of meaning and purpose? And that's really what I'm interested in, is identifying Where are people stuck and struggling? I've been there myself. I know what it feels like. It's awful. It can be big or small, doesn't matter. It's just awful. It could be triggered by something small or significant. How do we overcome that? And then actually, what's the next stage? How do we grow? How do we live from here? And that's where the meaning-centered therapeutic approaches that I'm particularly interested in come into play, and all the other body language stuff to help people on that journey. So that's my kind of I'm formally doing it, as opposed to I was informally doing it before. And now I'm away from a certain world, means that I can have I don't have to be looking over my shoulder. So
yeah, I'm not doing this from the sales ploy of making everyone watching or listening think, wow, we really need to find out more about this course right now and secure it while there is the introductory special offer discount. Or at least that's not my main motive for bringing this up, although it will likely entice some people. One, we've covered how this stuff can be used in all different areas of life, but in particular, let's talk about post-traumatic stress disorder a little more, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder, whatever label you want to give it. A lot of therapists are led to believe this is something that will take hours and hours and hours and hours and multiple sessions in order to enable somebody to totally overcome that block or release all that negative anchors and emotions that keep surfacing, or they keep replaying, or different experiences for different people.
Yeah.
And yet I know from my own personal experience that in a lot, and I'm saying in a lot, not all by any means, and I'm not saying in the majority either, but I'm saying in a lot of cases, it is possible to get truly life-changing results in a single session. Now, some viewers or listeners might be going, well, yeah, if your session's 5 hours, say, then that's like having had 5 sessions. No, what I mean is, it may be a conventional 60 to 90-minute session, albeit that in truth, a lot of that wouldn't have been therapeutic work anyway. It would have been rapport getting or talking or whatever. The actual process that leads to the release, I'll say, and that massive change and offloading positively can often happen in a matter of 5-10 minutes sometimes, albeit that it actually is happening in a split second with the culmination of seeds planted over the 5, 10, 15 minutes or whatever. And I know recently we spoke about, you had such a recent experience of this, didn't you?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that, so I'm going to take one step back and then we'll sort of zoom in on that specifically. And I think when it comes to trauma, and trauma can happen because of, and it's not because we're weak people, it's just a certain particular frame of mind we're in, a particular context. People can get traumatized and live with stuff from what we would look at and think, why would that bother you? And then you went through that and it didn't bother you. Why would that small thing? That's a whole nother conversation, but it happens. And I think that when people think about trauma and, you know, how quickly does it take to get over it, they conflate 2 things. Number one, the actual horrible feelings, the hypervigilance, the intrusive thoughts, the dreams, and living a wonderful, full, empowered life. I think they're 2 different things. So when people think about getting over trauma, they think that they're both the same thing. It's the painful stuff and then living in a really whole manner. Actually, I think that the trauma is the one thing, and then how do we then learn how to live is the next thing that happens. Because when it comes to the trauma, so I was working with a guy, be careful what I say, he is a military guy, and been involved with, and they like to say this, the theatre of conflict, but some horrific things for years and years and years. And basically, this particular individual had intrusive thoughts that he kept inside himself, which had affected his behaviors negatively, his relationships negatively, for about 20 years. And so we were working together, and I approached the trauma in terms of the feeling. What do you want? I want to not feel like this. I do not want these thoughts going on in my head. So we used some techniques over a period of an hour. That was the session, over an hour. And they're techniques that are now being very well researched. You know, if you look at the research on EMDR, eye movement desensitizing, forgotten the brain fog now.
EMDR, eye movement desensitization,
reconcile.
reprogramming.
That's the one.
As I like to call it, the finger waggling bollocks. Because whilst there is research saying it gets results, it does. But what it doesn't take into account is the fact that research doesn't look at the fact that the real result is achieved through the therapist expressing their intent it's going to work, their belief through the Pygmalion-Rosenthal effect.
Oh, yeah, okay.
The client picking up on that and therefore kicking in the Galatea effect that they then believe it will work. The fact that the Hawthorne effect of follow up and checking how the client's getting on is in there. The fact that the importance that's put on it in the testing environment helps trigger off the placebo trigger, which then when they get the outcome is the placebo effect. All of these things and many others that we'll talk about are actually why EMDR works when it works, not because you've wiggled the eyes in a certain manner.
That's why you're controversial, and I love it because you're poking and provoking the very assumptions behind how people are doing research on this, because it appears to be from the research.
It's impossible to do research into any psychological talking therapist, persuasion or influence without the Pygmalion effect, Galatea effect, Hawthorne effects, placebo effect, nocebo effect, and a whole bunch of other things that we will go into. Being present, it's impossible to eliminate them because in a manner where the testing would be legal and allowable and acceptable and publishable. Because by virtue of doing the testing, the tester has a preconceived idea, or even if they don't, they have a belief in the importance of it, and so the cycle begins.
See, that's very interesting because I mean, I know, you know, I'm aware of this stuff. I know this stuff, and I've pondered this because it's impossible, therefore, to untangle what's in the midst of it. And I think the best thing is to just be honest and say, look, all those rapport-based things are happening, and that's why this rapport stuff and how you break that down for me is the key. All the other techniques and stuff are all the other techniques, and you know, if you use them with a good intention and it's positive. So we can get into all of that, but with this particular person, we did whatever we did, and it was more somatic. It wasn't using your brain in terms of talking therapy. So it wasn't a CBT approach to deal with that thing and the reframing. It was an experience using a somatic, what's the fancy word, modality or therapy or whatever, using a somatic thing, a brain-based therapy, whether it's EMDR, eye movement integration, which came out of Bandler and Grinder, which actually, EMDR was influenced by that, and then brain spotting. You got all these various brain eye movement.
Bandler and Grinder's eye movement stuff, it again is both bollocks and true. If you take it literally, the way Bandler and Grinder taught it, so Bandler and Grinder.
That's an app, isn't it?
Taught it. The idea is that everyone, the direction of their eyes means certain things, the way they go. And the fact is, in the real world, that isn't true.
No.
You have to actually, the principle is true that once you understand what direction the person in front of you's eyes move when reconstructing memories or constructing a lie or feeling and all that, once you know what is correct, accurate, specific, bespoke to them, or you've calibrated it, is the fancy term will be in NLP, to find out what is their directions. Yes, you will find a lot of people fit the textbook, but not everyone by any means. In fact, a lot of people don't, and you have to calibrate them, don't you?
Yeah, you do. And I think so. One of the things that was interesting for me is dealing with the intrusive emotions. Actually, as you say, it's actually relatively quick, actually, and the research as well suggests that it could be quick, even, you know, regardless of what other effects are taking place, certainly with things like EMDR and those eye movement therapies, is the average of 3 to 6 sessions is eliminating the initial traumatic experience and all the other associated things. I mean, compared to talking therapies, it's like night and day. However, the question that I was getting from people when they were saying, oh, I feel better, was what next? And I think it's the what next bit takes time in terms of, okay, who are you, how are you wired, what do you want, when do you want it? It's the building of a life after that that has been, for many people, shattered by trauma. And actually, that's the bit that takes the time, because it does take time to maybe say, well, what are my values? What do I really want? What are the things that I might need to put in place now that I am free or freer from all of that? Because I've damaged or wounded all sorts of things in the process, myself included. You know, for example, not for me, I'm talking about myself, but in a therapeutic context, I have damaged myself. I have damaged relationships. I've gone into a career that I didn't really want to go into because it was informed so much by this hypervigilance, hyperactivity. Actually, there's things about me that I want to rediscover. Now, whether you want to get into Jungian psychodynamics or whatever, I don't know. But I think that that's the bit that takes the time, or can take the time, longer time. And people put those two together and say, actually, got PTSD. There's no way you can get better after 1 session or 3 sessions. Well, actually, a bit of that gets dealt with there, but actually the length of time is in the journey from A to B, and actually helping and accompanying somebody along the process. And actually, one therapist may be good for one element, and they need to go to somebody else for another element. And there's that as well. It doesn't have to be one size fits all with one therapist.
And a large part of that, in my terms, is that you need to help the individual to let go of any self-blame, shame, guilt, regret that they may have been carrying around, and anger as well, maybe, or may suddenly manifest.
Yeah.
So the kind of trauma's dealt with, but then the self-blame, shame, guilt, regret, and anger could surface of, why the fuck wasn't I able to deal with this sooner? Why have I lost all these months and years of my life?
Yeah. And that is so, John, that's so common. People I talk to, particularly ex-military or survivors of whatever trauma or catastrophe, their mate is blown up next to them and they're not. They managed to escape when they didn't.
Survivor's guilt.
And it is rife. And that blame, shame, guilt, etc. that you talk about is exactly it. And it's helping people navigate that. And again, I want to emphasize again the ability to create a high trust relationship with somebody in a therapeutic context, a coaching context, a business deal context, due diligence. I get asked to sit in due diligence meetings and pick the right people for the right thing for a big deal, or whether it is around cultivating a friendship with somebody who's an interest of the state. At the end of the day, we have to be, it's about intention. And people can, I don't know how it works, although they're beginning to do more and more research with fMRI scanning and electromagnetic fields testing around, people when they think about certain things. But it's about this sense of connection, rapport, trust. If we can put that in a bottle, and this is what I try to do, how do we put that into a bottle? How do we distill that red sauce reduction to something that's really rich that actually we can just use? That's if there is any magic, it's that. In my experience, I'm sure there's other people who disagree, but it's that thing.
I would argue that we are going to bottle that magic sauce, as it were,
great,
into the interpersonal neurosynchrony training package. So just before we end up this sort of taster into things, mentioned energy again. again, without wishing to be arty-farty, winky-wanky, tree-hugging, new agey sounding, because some energetic stuff is just bollocks to rip people off. But some of it has a basis, and a couple of things that I find interesting. One is somatics. I think I've said that right. I may have had a brain fart. Cymatics. It's the, if you type it into YouTube. In fact, you know what? I'm just going to open a window as we speak and make sure that I've said the correct word. Cymatics is a subset of modal vibrational phenomenon. The term was coined by the Swiss physician Hans Jenny. Typically, the surface of a plate, diaphragm, or membrane is vibrated, and regions of maximum and minimum displacement are made visible in a thin coating of particles, paste, or liquid. Right. Or to put it another way, search cymatics, C-Y-M-A-T-I-C-S on YouTube, and you'll see how sounds have visual imagery. So different sounds, different vibrations will make, through vibrations, the particles on this plate that vibrates to the sounds of the music or whatever, form geometric shapes, and it's different geometric shapes for different sounds. Just like you get different shapes in snowflakes. So that's one thing worth looking at that demonstrates that sound waves, which is why quite often shouting, if it's with an intent, can make people, oh, what's going on? Just talking calmly, it's going to be okay. Different voice tones have different effects. It's a similar thing. Another thing worth looking at is Emoto. Masaru Emoto. His first name is M-A-S-A-R-U. Second name Emoto, E-M-O-T-O. Was a Japanese businessman, author, and he's termed here on Wikipedia as pseudoscientist, who claimed that human consciousness could affect the molecular structure of water.
Okay, yes, now, I've read those studies.
There's people who poo-poo it. There's people who say it's true. If there's any truth in it, it was the idea that if you got water from the same source and took it, and this glass of it, we shouted it and we were really angry and then stuck it in a freezer, and the other we said loving, nice things to and put it in a different freezer. That afterwards, when they were looked at under the microscope, the one that they had a totally different form. It was obvious to a blind man which had been focused with anger and nasty thoughts as opposed to positive. Some say it's pseudoscience, but I would say it's another example of how energy and intent, and may also, without wishing to be religious, be why the process of saying grace or saying a prayer, we're thankful for the food we are about to receive before eating the Sunday dinner, because you don't know how that animal got murdered, so it could have had stress and negativity, which some studies would show make it more likely to cause disease. Whereas giving out this positive intent, some would argue, is changing the harmonics and the energy frequencies.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe a little bit out there, but what's your thoughts on that stuff?
So uncharacteristically, I'm going to move from my normal, I enjoy abstract and teaching and all the other things around it, and say practically it cashes out like this, in my experience. If I go into whatever setting, it's a high stakes setting, regardless of what the context is. It might be high stakes because it's important to somebody else. It might be high stakes because I think I want to get out of here alive. I set my intention up before I go in. How do I want to be? How do I want to come across? How much am I going to focus on them? What do I want them to see, feel, hear, come away with, the outcome frame, all that kind of stuff?
But NLP might refer to that, for example, as well-formed outcomes. The old idea of you need to know where you're going, otherwise how do you know when you've got there, and how do you know you need to form your signpost in advance to know what you're looking for, so that you know when you need to change course, if at all, to get to the destination.
Absolutely. You're starting with the end in mind and working backwards, however we want to phrase it. My experience has been that when I have that well formed, to use that NLP thing, formed, and not just well formed in terms of cognitively formed. Oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, but actually visually, emotionally, where I get invested into it, I perform better, or it is perceived that I perform better. There are known things that are happening. You could break that down and say, right, this is what he's doing around with trust. This is what you're doing linguistically. These are the small tells you're spotting from somebody else, which you are reading as points of interest because there's an amygdala spike or there's an arousal state, and you're using that as a data point to come back to. This is all the stuff we're going to cover because this is what we've been breaking down. But there's also unknown things. And I wonder if some of those unknown things that are yet, we haven't got the devices to even measure it, but instinctively we think, there's something going on here. I wonder if that may explain that pseudoscience becomes science because we have better ways of measuring it now. And that's what's taking place. It's a bit like, what do they call it now? M-brain theory, three-brain theory. You've got a massive neural bundle in our head, massive neural bundle in our heart, massive neural bundle in our guts, and we're
The
feeding
three
this stuff very
brains,
quick.
yeah.
Three brain. And I wonder if,
which was alluded to for years, you know, they all saying, don't let your head rule your heart. And the reason is because research is showing there's more neural pathways going from the heart to the brain than there is from the brain to the heart. And then in commonality of life, there was always the phrase, go with your gut, follow your gut instinct. And the clues have always been there. Head brain for logic and thought and analysis. Heart brain for emotions and interactions and such. Gut brain for fight, flight, freeze, shite stuff.
And feed. So and any other F you might think of. But I mean, of course, guys like, I mean, say for example, Gavin De Becker, The Gift of Fear. It's a classic book on, you know, he's interviewing people basically who have survived attacks, and they are reporting that they had an instinct that something wasn't right and it was beyond rational top-down cognition, so they thought, but it was something visceral in them. Now, it might be the amazing pattern matching ability of the implicit memory of when the thalamus communicates with the amygdala, and then it goes and checks different parts of the brain to see if it's right and all that. It may be that, or it may be that, and this ability for us as human beings to feel emotional changes in the environment we go into on the largest organ on our body, which is the skin, and whether the skin picks up something. So there's all sorts of research out there, which goes right back to the very beginning of why do we need these fancy words? Well, maybe we don't, but we certainly need people to do some research so that actually some of these instinctive things are like, oh no, there's some research that bears this out. And notwithstanding all the stuff, you know, is it grey research? Is it pure research? Is it who's putting money behind it, etc.? But notwithstanding all that stuff, actually, there are people researching this. And if it gives us as practitioners, as it goes through the interpreter person type to the application people, as practitioners, it gives us more confidence to therefore serve other people as effectively as possible to help them move to A to B. And maybe, you know, with I like thinking of the best for everybody in mind. With the right intention, we're not manipulating people negatively, but we're taking all that great research, maybe putting it into words that people like me can understand, and actually saying, oh, do you know what? I feel I can do this with a pure intention and with great confidence. And if challenged and scrutinized, you know, this is what the boffins are saying. It's been tested, and actually we can make the world a better place. Maybe that's my utopian idea of how to use this stuff. But hey, I'm a bit of a dreamer anyway, so that's how I'm going to be.
Nothing wrong with that. I've got, before I give you the floor to wrap up this what has basically turned into, will be at some point, an episode of Hypnosis Week to announce the forthcoming launch of the Interpersonal Synchrony video and audio and related worksheets training package, which means that when you do actually get to watch or listen to this, viewers and listeners, please do us a favour to help spread the word, to help more people, to change more lives positively. Share this far and wide on your social medias. Click like, make a comment below. All of these things help the algorithms to show this to more people. And of course, remember that below this video or below the speaker symbol on the audio podcast platform will be a link. And that link will take you to the page where you will be able to order the Interpersonal Neurosynchrony course, because it will be ready when this gets released. The sooner you go to that, the more affordable, better value for money, and ridiculously cheap the introductory offer will be, but it will run out sort of 7 days after this goes live, and then go back to a more realistic price that will still be immense, and I do mean immense value for money, because of the life-changing potential of mastering these techniques, not just from the therapeutic or magician or mind trickster's perspective that I will share, but more importantly, I'm pointing with two fingers because we don't know which way the video ends up when it records, from Paul's perspective of having used these therapeutically in business context and at the cutting edge, high-end level that could get you bloody killed. Because I always work, if something will work in the most stressful, dangerous of environments, it's just going to become even easier for you to use in environments that the only thing can be a positive outcome. So with all that in mind, we mentioned research, and this is what triggered this off in my head. There is research, and along the way we will go into that a bit, but into layman's terms and stuff. And if you choose to then go off and learn more of the winky-wanky terms, fine. But there won't be any need to, because between myself and Paul, we will have translated it into layman's terms, so that most importantly, you can understand it to the level to get out there and actually start practically applying these techniques in business, in your personal life, in the dating arena, if you're a salesperson to get more sales, if you're a therapist to help your clients reach their resolutions more rapidly, safely, and effectively, if you're negotiating contracts to get a better outcome for everyone involved on a win-win level more rapidly and harmoniously. You name it, every area of life can improve with the techniques that Paul and myself will be sharing. Paul in particular, I'll just be giving my little thoughts and prodding the wasp's nest, so to speak. So to end this one, I'm going to prod the wasp's nest one more time and mention this, that post-war, Joseph Mengele, who was responsible for many atrocities in Nazi Germany, was smuggled out of Germany by the CIA into America. That is not a conspiracy theory. It's now a documented fact with documents that have been released. You can go searching for them if you want. The fact is that's now confirmed as a fact, not a conspiracy theory. Indeed, everything I'm about to say, you can go and research and find for yourself, is no longer considered a conspiracy theory. Well, some people consider it that, but it isn't, because it's backed up by cold hard facts, most of which come from the CIA themselves, having declassified documents. Namely, that Joseph Mengele was smuggled into America, and one of the things he worked on was a thing called MK Ultra, Mind Control Ultra, so-called mind and then control with a K, because that is the German spelling of it, because he and other Nazis were involved. And now the nice cover story for this was that they were investigating to find ways to help people with shell shock, or as we now call it, post-traumatic stress disorder. That was their cover story, or may have been possibly their original intention, if we're being nice to them. But that was their cover story. The truth is that during this, they had to inflict traumas on people to see how it was inflicted in order to work out how to remove it and overcome it.
Yes.
And as a result, MK Ultra ultimately was a massive study on trauma-based mind control. Now, that could be physical trauma, sexual abuse trauma, or just emotionally induced trauma. But nonetheless, trauma-based mind control, and how to use this to influence, persuade, and manipulate people to do things both with their conscious knowledge and also without their conscious knowledge and without their consent, involving also drugs and hypnosis and such things. And at the same time as MK Ultra was going on in the States, some elements, offshoots of different MK projects were being run at the Tavistock Hospital in London, as it was then called, which later morphed into the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, which is now on in a back street of London, as its offices in exactly the same building as the British Psychological Society. Is that a coincidence? I think not. The British Psychological Society, those who look at the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Illness and Disease, a book that's voted on by a committee of what a new label should be given to a so-called mental illness or disease, so they can justify prescribing drugs that often, as is the case with antidepressants, have little or no additional benefit other than placebo. Depression being a prime example with Irving Kersh's book, The Emperor's New Drugs. He did a meta-analysis of all the studies, and it showed that basically placebo was as effective or more effective than the actual chemical drugs themselves. Anyway, Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, apparently just about how to persuade people for your organization's aims and all this. That's the cover story on their website. And yet their roots are in MK Ultra, trauma-based mind control. And interestingly, an offshoot of the Tavistock Hospital has its offices outside the Houses of Parliament in Westminster and is known as the Behavioural Insights Team, or as it's been dubbed in the world media, certainly during the pandemic of recent times, the nudge unit, because they openly admit that they find ways to nudge people to think differently or believe differently or act differently. All of these things are being used, some would say, for the positive intent and aims of government, although government itself is made up of two words, govern, control, and ment, mind. So government means mind control. But others would argue are being used nefariously. In any event, those techniques that they've spent millions and billions of pounds over the decades in studying and have only publicly admitted to a certain degree, because they always are 5 or 6 steps ahead of the game, are further proof that the kind of techniques that myself, by prodding the nest, and Paul by sharing that he's used in the non-state diplomat world and other arenas, are based in, if governments are using them, there's a reason. And one other thing I'll mention for people is that along the way we'll probably mention a thing called Project Mockingbird, which was the fact that the CIA openly admitted in the 60s into the 70s that they were planting people into the media as presenters on TV and radio shows, as journalists, to control the narrative that the public got to hear, to help influence, persuade, and control. They say that ended, but you've only got to look at the fact that, for example, Rupert Murdoch, one of the world's most powerful media moguls, seems to have backed every winning horse, so to speak, in every election for decades now. Is it that politics influences the media, or is it media that influence the politics? Are they both being run by more powerful forces? What are your thoughts on what some would consider to be somewhat conspiracy theory comments that I've just made?
My goodness, that's what I think. And you are a naughty boy, a very naughty boy, to be all Monty Python. What do I think? So I have to be careful what I say, because I'm still linked and have relationships with people who have operated at the very highest levels in certain states in global propaganda, leading it. So yes, I am aware of very sophisticated ways of using propaganda, which starts off by looking like it is completely against the outcome that they want, but you need to create, and you'll know this stuff off the back of your hand,
Click insert,
destabilization.
excellent book, Propaganda by Edward Bernays.
Yeah, okay, yeah, you've got it. So it is true that in order to create, if you
Sorry,
want,
you were going to mention destabilization,
yeah,
defragmentation.
destabilization. So you need to create destabilization in order to open people up for greater suggestion to accept a solution. Now, the destabilization may be completely opposite to the solution you want, but you need to create it to start off with in order to create that level of interest and or hunger and or need in order for people to say yes. So they're more open to suggestion. So that does take place. We know that takes place. I think as
somebody like
eyes...
David Icke refers to that as problem, reaction, solution.
Okay, I've not come across this stuff, but
creates the problem. The governments will create the problem, so it creates a reaction of anger or fear or some emotionally heightened reaction, so that then the governments can come along and provide the solution, or rather, ideally, end up that the mass populace, when they react, start requesting a solution, and the only solution that would be logical is the one that the government wanted to impose in the first place, maybe more surveillance, for example. But because it's now suddenly being demanded by people, there's less resistance.
Yeah, and I think it's maybe, I'm an English guy, so maybe it's more comfortable for me to think that other states do that, because there's evidence that other states do it. And I suppose the question is, and does this state do it? Well, I'll let viewers work out whether they think that might be the case or not. I also know individuals who are at the very top of, pretty high up actually, in particular organizations that influenced certain campaigns on Facebook by harvesting data, and their parent company.
That was done by a company called Cambridge Analytica, with parents' company with Strategic Communications Limited, I think. No,
that might well be the case, Jonathan.
So, I mean, if viewers or listeners wanted to discover more about that, if they went to my friend Neil Saunders' website, Neil, Neil, Sanders, Sanders, Neil Saunders, Mind Control, .com or .co.uk, it's one of them. You will find he has an audio podcast with multiple episodes going into all the provable, documented truth about how Cambridge Analytica was a military grade weapon of the British government. You had to get permission to use it. It was a proper psychological warfare, psychological operations, PSYOP, call it what you will, mind control weapon used to influence the Brexit campaign, the Trump campaign, and various other political campaigns around the world, I do believe.
Yes. So I know individuals who have been whistleblowers at the senior levels in the state actors and in organizations such as the ones that you talk about, perhaps, that the revelations, the things that they've been engaged with and seen and been part of strategizing around are staggering, but they are only bigger and more sophisticated versions with a set of intentions behind them, which I would suggest in a lot of cases are negative, of the stuff, in inverted commas, that anybody uses wittingly or unwittingly, and we can understand how to do this when they want to genuinely help somebody move from A to B. How do we inoculate ourselves against that is the countermeasures or inoculation. So I get asked sometimes, I do this kind of stuff. to work with individuals who may be people of means, well known to certain people, and how do we prepare their children when they're traveling to not be manipulated by nefarious actors. And it's all down to, again, it's about how people use trust, false teaming, create destabilization, you know, a classic one that you can do. And this speaks to this point. It's just a micro version of what's happening at a macro level in terms of influence and persuasion, that if you destabilize somebody, you hijack their amygdala, which then triggers things in the system faster than the thinking brain can cope with, known as the prefrontal cortex, and therefore they're open to suggestion. That's what's happening. And the way you inoculate yourself against that in terms of everyday life is watch less media. It's as simple as that. Consume less media, because the evidence is there. It's designed to get an outcome, and every tool and technique is used in order to do that. So just watch less stuff. Fast it, if you want to use a religious terminology, just fast media, you know, just get off the thing for a while, and actually you'll find that your stress levels will go down, your suggestibility, all that kind of stuff. And then with these individuals I talk to train them to say, look, watch for this. And we go through different exercises. If there's a shock that happens in a pub or a bar and you're traveling, if there's a loud noise and somebody approaches you very quickly after the loud noise and asks you to go with them, show them something, or strike up a conversation or whatever, be very, very wary, because you're highly suggestible at that moment, because you are either consciously or unconsciously, depending on how big the stress is, reacting to the destabilization. It's the same as propaganda. It could be a loud noise. It could be an engineered crash outside a venue. It could be something happening in the bar, a smashed glass next to you, and all of a sudden somebody appears and helps you. You know, be very wary in situations. And it doesn't mean we have to be suspicious, but it's how propaganda works. It creates destabilization, creates the need, and provides a solution.
What you've just described would be so-called social engineering or social conditioning.
100%.
An extreme version of operant conditioning, Pavlov's dog, elements of stuff that we will definitely go into in different episodes. But people think of this as being the stuff of films. But there are organizations that actually go to these extremes in the real world, aren't they?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, everything from, you know, when you think about, I mean, this sounds very 007, and it's not 007, but it's exfiltrations. So say, for example, certain wars that are happening around the world, how do you get people out of those situations when you can't enter those countries? There are groups of people that will enter those countries, and they may use very physical means to do that, special ops groups, mercenary groups. But there'll also be settings as well where there's stable situations where they need somebody to go in and profile the behavior of people in that environment, to brief the people ahead of the exfiltration that's going to take place, and you're building trust with people, etc. They're using all of these techniques. And for your listeners and the viewers, what's been amazing to me is that people think that these techniques that are used in this security world or intelligence world that it must be very, very different to what we could use in therapy or business. No, they're exactly the same, because human beings are exactly the same. And that's been something that's been a joy and a surprise to me, is actually they're the same principles. And it's just that it's going right back to the beginning. People just use different words to mean the same thing. And the words make it sound like hocus pocus, fancy schmancy, secret squirrel. I can tell you from my experience, if you're operating legally, you are using the same stuff. Now, of course, if you're shutting somebody in a room, which I don't do and haven't done, to create compliance, yeah, you're using stuff. But then some of our greatest mentalists are using compliance techniques as well. But they can just do it on stage.
We're using that in the context of like Darren Brown doing mind reading, apparent things on stage.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that they're using a lot of these techniques, and they are masterful at it. And the editing team are obviously outstanding. I mean, I don't watch much stuff. I don't watch a lot of media, mainly because I've seen how people use it. So I have a very strict diet on my media consumption because I'm as suggestible as everybody else. I'm not immune, so I I take my own medicine and say just lay off eating too much of the media.
Now, just before we end, and I'm going to come back to you for the last words, I'm just going to somewhat, some will think egotistically and arrogantly, but hey, I'll get used to it, make some blatant plugs. But these are plugs for things that are free of charge. It's going to cost you absolutely nothing. All you need to do is tap into your keyboard, youtube.com/celebrity hypnotist. That is my YouTube channel. If you click on playlists, there is a playlist there called Hypnosis Week, and that is where this video recording will be in video form. So if you're listening to this on an audio podcast and you want to see our body language and smiley faces and stuff, then go to the Celebrity Hypnotist YouTube channel, click on playlist, then click on Hypnosis Week and look for this episode, which will have in its title Interpersonal Neuro Synchrony, and you'll be able to see the visual version of it. But whilst you're there, set yourself aside 3 or 4 hours to take a bigger dip into these areas and check out episode 17 of Hypnosis Week, where I interview my friend and colleague Robert Phipps on body language and non-verbal communication. Episode number 58 of Hypnosis Week, where I interviewed Chase Hughes, author of the Ellipsis Manual on Mind Control, Persuasion, Influence and Negotiation. Episode 73, where I interview American hypnotist Tom Silver, who openly talks about how to create mind-controlled assassins and stuff like that. The fact that you can make people do things against their will and against their conscious moral values and whatnot. And most recently, episode 117, where I interview author of Free Your Mind, one of the co-authors, Patrick Fagan, who actually used to work for about 8-9 months towards the end for Cambridge Analytica. And we talk a bit more about Cambridge Analytica in that. Those things will pique your mind even more, but they won't even scrape the surface on what you can learn, what you will learn, and what you will benefit from by going to the link below this video or below the audio speaker on the audio podcast channel, clicking that link and going and grabbing with both hands like a crazy hungry madman who's not eaten in weeks, getting their first chance to get a nice 3-course meal. Go right now and grab your early bird discount access to the complete Interpersonal Neurosynchrony video and audio training package, where you're going to learn about all the things that I've mentioned, all the things that Paul has mentioned, our views on each other's things, different perspectives, and a whole bunch of gold as well that we haven't even talked about in this episode. Stuff that will literally blow your mind, but give you almost superhero tool bag of skills that you can use in all areas of life. I give you the floor, Paul. What would you say to people who are thinking about, would it benefit them to sign up to the Interpersonal Neurosynchrony course?
So from a selling point of view, in my corporate world, our close rate is 80%. And the guy I work with is, former banking guy, and he said, Struth, he said, what we're doing is extraordinary. And I said, it isn't, in as much as it's taking some very well-known principles and boiling them down into bite-sized chunks that people can use. People want that stuff because they want to get on in life and enjoy life, etc. So if you're interested in applicable skills that are easily remembered, and I even create crib sheets if you're in meetings doing stuff, and you can do quick profiles of people in meetings so that you can communicate with greater efficiency, whatever content you've got in their structure. That's another thing altogether. Then this is the kind of stuff for you. If you're really skilled, a lot of this stuff, which I'm sure you are, because that's why you're doing what you do, what I can help you do is to basically slow the process down so that you can A, codify what you're doing, so you can replicate it and teach other people, and B, maybe, just maybe say, hey, there might be some stuff you haven't thought about here. It has an 80% hit rate when it comes to linguistics and body language and profiling and behavioral mapping and there's going to be some stuff in there for you as well. And so, yeah, and I would say, actually, there's always something for everybody. And it's about just relaxing, slowing the internal clock down and grabbing hold of some of these things and actually seeing my old saying, big doors swing on small hinges. Or as Pareto says, 80% of the results come from 20% of the input. So let's find out the 20% that's going to get you the 80, because life's too busy to try and fill up with other stuff.
Yeah, indeed. And that's practical real world stuff, whether it's to sell more, help therapy clients achieve results quicker. Maybe there's people coming from the entertainment arena who want to be like Darren Brown. Now, the truth is, I know that arena inside out, and I can tell you a lot of the stuff. It's purely a presentation, a storyline to the routine. And the actual secret is a magic trick and not anything to do with psychological principles. However, the stuff that we're going to be teaching will actually genuinely enable you to do things that look like and feel like, to the people you do them, like you are reading their minds, or if you are so inclined, like you are some kind of psychic phenomenon. We will talk about cold reading, hot reading, psychological profiling, personal as well. That this is just, I'm so excited that this, after a good number of weeks of getting together every few days or a couple of times and recording this, it's finally available to you guys and girls to learn from, to benefit from, and to put to use in the real world. And with that in mind, go to the link now. Go, 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 go. The clock is ticking on that super early bird. But if you've missed the super early bird, if you come up across this months down the line or weeks down the line, don't worry, it's still going to be genuinely, I know it sounds like a sales pitch, the best investment you ever make, as long as you do one key thing. Can you guess what that one key thing is? I'm going to say, Paul, I think you probably know me well enough by now.
Sign, press the button.
Well, that's one thing. They should do that now. But you know what? It's not good enough just to get the neuro interpersonal neurosynchrony course. Just getting it's going to do nothing. You have to actually watch it and listen to it. But watching and listening to it is also, well, it will help you be more aware of things, but you actually have to put it to use in the real world, or in your world of therapy, or in the dating arena, or in the sales arena, or whatever arena you want to use it in. You've actually got to put it into action, because without taking action, you're not going to notice any change. But all the tools you need will be given to you, mainly by this genius, Mr. Paul Gutteridge, and I'll just stalk the wasp's nest along. So it's thank you from me, and it's, as the two Ronnies would say,
thank you from him.
We'll be with you soon. Go hit that link and join us on the inside.